Have you ever stopped to think that perhaps the greatest danger in your life isn't failure, but rather the mediocre success that keeps you exactly where you are? What if I told you that the sense of security you treasure so much could actually be the most sophisticated trap you've built for yourself? There's a brutal difference between being comfortable and being prepared for what life truly has to offer. Niccolò Machiavelli, over 500 years ago, observed something disturbing about human nature. The most dangerous men were those who remained too long in stable situations, not because they were weak, but because stability made them predictable, vulnerable, and paradoxically less prepared to face inevitable changes. Today we're going to dive into this timeless wisdom and discover why your comfort zone might be the silent obstacle between you and the extraordinary version of yourself you haven't met yet. The first uncomfortable truth that Machiavelli discovered through his political and military observations is this: comfort breeds complacency, and complacency is the first step toward irrelevance. He studied countless cases of leaders, cities, and empires that became vulnerable precisely in the moments when they felt most secure. History is filled with examples of fortresses considered impregnable that fell, not from weakness, but from overconfidence generated by prolonged feelings of security. When you remain too long in the same routine, the same activities, with the same people, something insidious happens in your brain. You develop what we can call adaptive myopia, a growing inability to perceive changes in the environment around you. It's as if your mental antennas gradually lose sensitivity, leaving you increasingly disconnected from transformations that constantly occur in the external world. Machiavelli observed that military commanders who remained too long in peacetime frequently lost their capacity for rapid response when conflicts finally emerged. They maintained the same strategies, the same equipment, the same thought patterns. While potential enemies evolved, innovated, and prepared for scenarios these commanders couldn't even imagine possible. The same principle applies entirely to your personal and professional life. When you maintain the same function for years without seeking new challenges, when you always frequent the same places, when you always have the same conversations with the same people, you're involuntarily limiting your growth potential and, more dangerously still, diminishing your capacity to adapt to inevitable changes. But the comfort zone isn't just about external stagnation. It operates much more subtly through what Machiavelli would call poorly calibrated self-preservation. Our primitive brain was designed to keep us alive in an environment where novelty frequently meant danger. This ancestral programming makes us interpret any unknown situation as potentially threatening, even when we rationally know it involves growth opportunities. Machiavelli understood that truly effective leaders needed to develop the ability to distinguish between genuine risks and productive discomfort. He observed that those who could make this distinction consistently were capable of making decisions that others considered too bold, but which in reality were simply well calculated. The comfort zone functions like an invisible bubble that gradually contracts around you. Initially, it may seem spacious and welcoming, but over time you realize it's becoming restrictive. Activities that were once natural begin to seem challenging. Conversations that once flowed easily become difficult. Opportunities that once sparked your interest now generate anxiety. This contraction process is particularly insidious because it happens gradually and imperceptibly. It's like being in a room where the temperature decreases 1 degree per day. You constantly adapt to the small changes until one day you realize you're shivering with cold in an environment you no longer recognize as familiar. Machiavelli identified a specific pattern in leaders who managed to avoid this trap. They deliberately placed themselves in uncomfortable situations on a regular and systematic basis. Not from masochism or recklessness, but because they understood that controlled discomfort was the antidote against atrophy of their adaptive capacities. There's a fundamental difference between destructive discomfort and constructive discomfort. The first results from poor preparation, impulsive decisions, or lack of planning. The second is a natural consequence of directed growth, calculated expansion of personal limits, and intentional development of new capacities. When Machiavelli wrote about the importance of a prince knowing both times of war and times of peace, he was articulating a broader principle, Adaptive versatility requires regular exposure to different types of challenges. A leader who knew only prosperity would be ineffective during crises. A commander who knew only conflicts would be inadequate for building during stable periods. Applying this to your personal reality means you need to deliberately seek experiences that expand your repertoire of skills, knowledge, and emotional capacities. If you work primarily with numbers, you need to develop interpersonal skills. If you're naturally introverted, you need to practice challenging social situations. If you've always been an employee, you need to understand entrepreneurial mindsets. The goal isn't to become a different person, but rather to develop the breadth of capacities that allows effective navigation through different contexts and circumstances. Machiavelli observed that the most enduring leaders were those who could be effective both in situations that favored their strengths and in situations that required skills they had to develop deliberately. One of the greatest illusions of the comfort zone is the belief that stability equals security. Machiavelli observed exactly the opposite. In a constantly changing world, the only true security comes from the ability to adapt quickly to new circumstances. Remaining static in a dynamic environment isn't stability, it's a recipe for obsolescence. Think about the transformations that have occurred in the last 10 years in practically all areas of human activity. Professions that seemed stable disappeared. Skills that were valued became irrelevant. Business models that worked for decades became obsolete in a matter of years. People who adapted prospered. Those who remained with the same approach faced growing difficulties. Machiavelli wrote that, "Whoever neglects what is done for what ought to be done walks toward ruin instead of preservation." This observation is profoundly relevant to the comfort zone question. When you focus exclusively on maintaining what you already have, instead of developing capacities for what may come, you're inadvertently preparing yourself for obsolescence. The comfort zone also operates through a psychological mechanism that Machiavelli intuitively understood: the human tendency to overestimate risks of action and underestimate risks of inaction. We focus intensely on possible problems that might result from trying something new, while ignoring inevitable problems that result from not evolving. This perceptual distortion leads us to make decisions that seem safe in the short term, but are risky in the long term. It's like choosing to stay in a building that's on fire because leaving it seems more dangerous than remaining in a familiar environment, even if that environment is becoming progressively more unsafe. Machiavelli observed that effective leaders developed an almost paradoxical ability. They could be simultaneously cautious and bold. Cautious in the sense of carefully evaluating real risks. Bold in the sense of acting decisively when they identified genuine opportunities for progress. This apparently contradictory combination becomes possible when you develop the skill to distinguish between rational fears and irrational fears. Rational fears are based on realistic evaluations of possible negative consequences. Irrational fears are products of ancestral programming that interprets any novelty as a threat, regardless of the real context. The first stage to escape the comfort zone is to honestly recognize where you currently are and which areas of your life have become excessively predictable or restrictive. This requires a level of self-honesty that can be uncomfortable, because we frequently discover that situations we justified as stable actually became limiting. Machiavelli always emphasized the importance of objective evaluations of reality, even when that reality wasn't pleasant. He believed that effective decisions could only be made from precise understanding of current circumstances, not from romanticized or minimized versions of the real situation. A useful technique is what we can call a personal expansion audit. Examine different areas of your life, professional, social, physical, intellectual, creative, and honestly identify how long it's been since you faced genuinely new challenges in each of these areas. Genuine challenges are those that require development of new skills or capacities, not just repetition of activities you already master. Machiavelli observed that accurate self-knowledge was the foundation of all effective strategy. You can't plan effective movements if you don't clearly understand your initial position. Similarly, you can't escape the comfort zone if you don't first identify where exactly that zone has become limiting. The second stage involves developing what Machiavelli would call calibrated appetite for discomfort. This doesn't mean seeking unnecessary suffering, but rather developing growing capacity to remain functional and focused in situations that are beyond your immediate experience. This capacity develops gradually through progressive exposure to increasing levels of challenge. It's like physical endurance development. You don't try to run a marathon on the first day of training, but systematically increase the distance and intensity of exercises until you develop the desired capacity. Machiavelli noticed that veteran soldiers weren't necessarily physically stronger than recruits, but had developed superior ability to maintain effectiveness even under extreme stress. They had passed through sufficiently varied and challenging experiences to develop confidence in their adaptation capacity. The same principle applies to personal development. The more success experiences you accumulate navigating through initially uncomfortable situations, the greater your confidence becomes in your ability to handle new challenges. This experience-based confidence is fundamentally different from blind optimism or arrogance. A practical approach is to identify a specific area where you feel you need to grow, but which you've avoided due to the discomfort involved. It could be professional networking, public presentations, negotiations, learning new technical skills, or any other activity you recognize as important but have postponed due to anxiety or uncertainty. Machiavelli always defended gradual and systematic approaches instead of dramatic and impulsive changes. Dramatic changes frequently generate excessive resistance, both internal and external, making them unsustainable. Gradual changes allow adaptation and capacity building over time. Start by defining the smallest possible step in this area that would be real progress, but not overwhelmingly intimidating. If the final goal is to become a confident presenter, the first step might be simply speaking more in small meetings. If the goal is to become an entrepreneur, it might be starting a small side project while maintaining your main occupation. The important thing is that each step is sufficient to generate real growth, but not so large as to create paralyzing resistance. Machiavelli observed that sustainable progress came from sequences of small victories that built momentum and confidence, instead of heroic attempts that frequently resulted in frustration and abandonment. The third stage involves developing what we can call support systems for expansion. Machiavelli always emphasized that no significant achievement was accomplished in isolation. Effective leaders built networks of allies, mentors, and resources that supported their objectives and provided feedback during development processes. In the context of escaping the comfort zone, this means identifying people who can offer guidance, encouragement, and external perspective during your growth process. It can include mentors who have already navigated through similar challenges, colleagues who are on parallel development journeys, or even professional coaches or consultants in specific areas. Machiavelli observed that external feedback was crucial because individuals frequently developed blind spots about their own progress. People too close to a situation may have difficulty objectively evaluating gradual changes in their capacities or identifying areas that still need attention. Besides people, support systems include practical resources that facilitate your expansion process. It could be investment in education, tools that increase your effectiveness, or environmental changes that make new behaviors more natural and sustainable. For example, if you're trying to develop networking skills, it might include participation in industry events, communication courses, or even changes in your personal appearance that increase your confidence in social situations. The goal is to create an environment that supports and facilitates the behaviors you're trying to develop. Machiavelli always thought systemically. He understood that lasting changes required alignment between personal objectives, available resources, and external environment. Trying to change only through willpower, without considering these other factors, rarely produced sustainable results. The fourth stage involves developing resilience for inevitable setbacks. Machiavelli observed that the path to any significant achievement included periods of difficulty, frustrations, and apparent regressions. Leaders who expected linear progress frequently gave up when they encountered the first real obstacles. Leaving the comfort zone isn't a smooth and predictable process. There will be moments when you feel incompetent, anxious, or tempted to return to the safety of familiar patterns. These moments aren't signs of failure. but natural and necessary stages of the growth process. Machiavelli wrote about the importance of maintaining long-term perspective during difficult periods. He observed that leaders who remained focused on larger objectives could tolerate temporary discomforts that would defeat those with short-term vision. A useful technique is developing what we can call personal growth narrative, a clear understanding of why you're deliberately placing yourself in uncomfortable situations and how these discomforts contribute to your long-term objectives. When you have clarity about the purpose behind discomfort, it becomes easier to persevere during difficult moments. Machiavelli also emphasized the importance of celebrating small victories along the way. Progress in challenging areas frequently happens in small increments that may seem insignificant day to day, but that accumulate into significant transformations over time. Keeping a record of your progress through journals, photos, videos, or any other method that works for you can help maintain perspective on how much distance you've already covered, especially during moments when progress seems slow or imperceptible. The fifth stage is perhaps the most sophisticated, developing the ability to find opportunities disguised as problems. Machiavelli was a master at identifying hidden advantages in apparently unfavorable situations. He observed that difficult circumstances frequently created possibilities that didn't exist during stable times. When you're expanding your comfort zone, you'll inevitably encounter situations that don't turn out as planned. Projects that don't work as expected, relationships that develop differently than anticipated, or skills that are more difficult to master than you imagined. The natural tendency is to interpret these developments as failures or reasons to reconsider your objectives. But Machiavelli would suggest a different approach, examining them as sources of valuable information about necessary adjustments in your strategy or as indicators of alternative opportunities you hadn't initially considered. Frequently, the most interesting and rewarding paths emerge when our original plans are interrupted by unforeseen circumstances. The key lies in maintaining sufficient mental openness to recognize these alternative possibilities instead of remaining rigidly fixed on specific plans. Machiavelli observed that adaptability was more valuable than any specific strategy. Leaders who could adjust their methods while keeping their essential objectives intact frequently achieved superior results to those who followed original plans even when circumstances changed. This doesn't mean being inconstant or abandoning projects at the first sign of difficulty, but rather developing sensitivity to distinguish between temporary obstacles that require persistence and genuine signs that strategic adjustments are necessary. A particularly valuable skill is learning to ask productive questions during moments of difficulty. Instead of, "Why is this happening to me?" or "Why is this so hard?" Questions like, "What is this teaching me?" or "What opportunities might this situation be creating?" Direct your attention to more useful aspects of the experience. Machiavelli frequently used military analogies, and one that applies here is the difference between tactical retreat and desertion. Tactical retreat is a strategic movement that preserves resources for future advances. Desertion is complete abandonment of objectives due to temporary difficulties. Sometimes, expanding your comfort zone requires temporary pauses for consolidation of gains or approach adjustments. The ability to distinguish between these strategic pauses and tendencies to return to limiting patterns is crucial for sustainable progress. The sixth stage involves building what Machiavelli would recognize as courage reserves, mental and emotional resources that sustain your capacity to remain in uncomfortable territory even during prolonged periods of uncertainty. Courage isn't the absence of fear, but rather the capacity to act appropriately even in the presence of fear. Machiavelli observed that courageous leaders weren't necessarily less anxious than others, but had developed superior capacity to function effectively even when they felt anxious or uncertain. This capacity develops through deliberate practice in progressively challenging situations. Each time you act appropriately despite feeling uncomfortable, you strengthen your confidence in your ability to handle future challenging situations. Courage reserves also include practices and resources that maintain your emotional stability during stress periods. It could be regular physical exercise, meditation practices, hobbies that provide relaxation, or any activity that restores your mental and emotional energy. Machiavelli always emphasized the importance of keeping resources in reserve for unforeseen situations. In the context of personal development, this means not investing all your emotional energy in a single growth area, but maintaining sufficient balance to sustain long-term efforts. It's tempting to try to transform multiple areas of your life simultaneously when you begin to see positive results from leaving the comfort zone. But Machiavelli would warn against this temptation, observing that limited resources applied to multiple objectives frequently result in unsatisfactory progress in all areas. A more effective approach is to focus intensely on one or two areas at a time, developing competence and confidence in these areas before expanding to new territories. This allows momentum building and avoids energy dispersion that can lead to frustration and abandonment. As you develop greater comfort with discomfort, you'll begin to notice changes in how you perceive opportunities around you. Situations that previously seemed intimidating or impossible begin to seem interesting and achievable. This perceptual shift is one of the most valuable benefits of consistently expanding your comfort zone. Machiavelli observed that experience was the best teacher of possibilities. People who had successfully navigated through challenging situations developed superior capacity to identify opportunities in circumstances that seemed discouraging to others. This perceptual expansion also applies to how you see other people and social situations. When you develop greater confidence in your social navigation capacity, it becomes easier to initiate conversations with interesting people, seek mentorship from individuals you admire, or participate in activities that previously seemed exclusive or intimidating. The process of escaping the comfort zone gradually transforms not just what you do, but fundamentally how you see yourself. You shift from someone who avoids challenges to someone who selectively seeks them. From someone who feels limited by circumstances to someone who finds creative ways to expand possibilities. This identity transformation is profound and lasting because it's based on concrete evidence of your capacity for growth and adaptation. It's not positive self-talk or forced optimism, but genuine confidence developed through accumulated experience of success in initially uncomfortable situations. Machiavelli was always realistic about human nature, including our tendency to return to familiar patterns during periods of stress or uncertainty. Therefore, it's important to develop systems that facilitate maintenance of expansive behaviors even when natural motivation diminishes. These systems can include public commitments to specific objectives, accountability partnerships with people who support your growth, or environmental structures that make expansive behaviors easier to maintain than limiting behaviors. For example, if you're trying to develop networking skills, you might commit to participating in a specific number of events per month, or form a partnership with a colleague who's also working on developing social skills, creating mutual accountability. Machiavelli observed that external structures were frequently more reliable than individual motivation for sustaining behaviors during difficult periods. Wise leaders created systems that supported their objectives instead of depending exclusively on willpower. As you progress in this journey of personal expansion, it's important to recognize and celebrate the transformation that's happening, not just in the external results you're achieving, but in the person you're becoming through the process. The version of you that consistently seeks growth, that remains functional during discomfort, that finds opportunities in challenges, and that maintains long-term perspective during temporary difficulties is fundamentally different from the version that remained within familiar limits for fear of uncertainty. This new version of yourself isn't just more capable of achieving specific objectives, but is better prepared to navigate a constantly changing world. You develop what Machiavelli would recognize as virtù, the capacity to thrive in varying circumstances while keeping your essential values and objectives intact. The final goal isn't to completely eliminate discomfort from your life. That would be impossible and counterproductive. The goal is to develop a more sophisticated relationship with discomfort, where you can distinguish between discomfort that signals genuine danger and discomfort that signals growth opportunity. Machiavelli understood that life would always include elements of uncertainty and challenge. The question wasn't how to avoid these realities, but how to develop capacities that would allow effective navigation through them and even finding advantages in situations others would consider purely problematic. When you develop these capacities, your comfort zone doesn't disappear but expands dramatically. Activities that once generated significant anxiety become part of your normal repertoire. Situations you once avoided become interesting opportunities to apply and develop your skills. This expansion is progressive and continuous. There's no endpoint where you've completed the personal growth process. There will always be new areas to explore, new skills to develop, and new challenges that can expand your capacities even further. Machiavelli viewed personal development as a lifelong journey that required constant attention and intention. He observed that even highly developed leaders could regress if they stopped deliberately challenging themselves. The difference is that, as you develop experience and confidence, the process becomes less arduous and more natural. You develop intuition for identifying growth opportunities, effective systems for navigating challenges, and an internal library of success experiences that informs future decisions. Eventually, seeking growth becomes not just something you do, but a fundamental part of who you are. You become the type of person who naturally seeks expansion possibilities, who feels energized by appropriate challenges, and who sees change as opportunity instead of threat. This identity transformation is perhaps the most valuable benefit of deliberately escaping the comfort zone. Not just the specific results you achieve, but the resilient, adaptable, and courageous person you become through the process. And now, we come to the moment of truth. After diving deeply into Machiavelli's insights about courage, growth, and the importance of embracing productive discomfort, I want you to reflect on this question. What is that area of your life that you know you need to expand, but have avoided due to fear or uncertainty? Comment below with one word that represents that challenge you're ready to face. Let's create a community of courageous people willing to grow. If this message resonated with you, if these principles make sense for your personal transformation journey, show it by leaving your like. It's through this feedback that we know we're delivering content that truly impacts lives and inspires real change. And if you're prepared to continue this personal development journey to discover more strategies based on the wisdom of history's great thinkers, subscribe to the channel and activate notifications. Our mission is to transform classical knowledge into practical tools for modern growth, and you're an essential part of this collective transformation. Remember, your comfort zone may be safe, but your dreams are outside of it.